Thank you, Anna, and thank you to DAI-SAI for the invitation. Although I've been here before on maybe other fronts as well, with my work in sort of like personal architectural practice and curatorial projects. But today I will be sharing something that I am working on in a more official capacity in Finland. I work in a government agency called TAIKE, the Arts Promotion Center Finland, which is an agency under the Ministry of Culture in Finland. And this, in a way, somehow binds together a lot of the discussions that we've had in the previous years, the project happening in Krvavica, and then also somehow Anna made me realize that it somehow ties my work also into this this picture. So it was an easy peasy after that realization. The center of it is a project that became like this publication. There are a few copies here. If someone is interested, it's in Finnish and in English. So maybe I'll just put them here so you can circulate or have a copy. There might be also some later shipment coming in at the DAI-SAI, so in case you're still later in Pula, it might be possible to pick one up. But it's also online, so as a PDF. Okay, so uusi paikallinen in Finnish means new local. And what's new about local? Nothing. It's always been local. But it's a kind of like this what says here is it means you're here, and you see the same dots as the kind of like everywhere you are there. So that's local. When in the bigger picture background is that Finland published or launched an architectural policy program first in the 90s, late 90s, and that became really popular in the country. And I guess all around Europe there was at the time kind of like a wave for architectural policy programs, and that's when there was also a lot of like European activities around it, and lots of like conferences and things. And in Finland also we experienced there was a national level program, and then there were like these local and regional level, sort of like city or region level programs. Then the activities and kind of the initiatives started, but then a little bit like slowed down and faded away. Until 2022, we published a new program that is going to kind of take us to the 1930s, or 2030s. So that's in the background, and the new policy program is like super extensive. Like it kind of like talks about everything in the world. It's trying to say how climate change and things about biodiversity are important, but then there's also like local meaning and identity kind of tied to the place where you're living, and there's about education and research and the changes that architecture and urban matters kind of like are needing, but there's also equality and social inclusion, about economy, like everything under the sun basically. So the world is becoming so complex that it's even hard to make programs, and it has these kind of graphs, like something that we should first use the buildings that we already have, and then only in the kind of like smallest of cases build anything new. And it tries to also chart out what architectural sustainability means. Not sustainability only as a built sort of a technical term, but how architecture, also an aesthetic of architecture, has to be sustainable and socially sustainable and so on. So that's what policy programs are for. It he also tries to say what is the role of local programs, like what sort of an added value those have. But since I work at the Agency for Arts and Culture, and I was reading the program that also I was part in drafting, writing, and then for our agency, it specifically has these two tasks or measures that we're supposed to produce some or make some kind of projects that promote the creation of local and regional policy programs and creating operating models for the development of the built environment in depopulating areas, for instance, in Finland, where this is quite common. So, working from the arts sector and the cultural sector, I'm thinking when I saw this like a few years ago that, like, what does this mean? Like, what are we supposed to do? And that's how this project got started. So Finland is a country where it's sort of like one of the least sort of like most sparsely populated in Europe. But it's populated very evenly, sort of like it's a big territory, but the area is quite big. And in the post-war era, when the country was somehow sort of experiencing this rebuilding and growth after the Second World War, this kind of like landscapes became very common. So the welfare state was sort of rural, slightly urban. There were a lot of like schools and municipal buildings and healthcare centers. But today, in many parts of Finland, the growth has concentrated on few cities, and these kind of landscapes are becoming harder and harder to manage. The welfare state somehow is leaving behind lots of empty buildings and farmland that isn't farmed. And just as a kind of a small statistics is that this is from '99. It says that it's sort of like the percentage of working age population. So when the first program was launched, everything looked kind of like good. And then if you think about the 1930s, that is in the new program, it will, all the sort of like markers are in red. The population will be sort of like only half of the population is in the working part of the workforce. And in the long term, the population will start to go down. So when then we were sort of like, okay, so we're supposed to somehow architecturally draft some strategies that can turn these big kind of graphs to like yeah, we cannot really do that. So what we can do is that to try to ask questions that what does it mean, those local initiatives and local possibilities in this kind of development for this kind of world. And so we launched an open call from the government for anyone interested. So basically anyone who was willing to care, who was willing to sort of reply that I have a local idea, that I would like to possibly do something. Maybe it can be a new program for your location, maybe it can become some sort of a village symposium, or maybe it could be a local day of architecture, or maybe it's just a group of friends, or maybe it's your family, or maybe it's you and your colleagues at the municipality. And we launched it in the spring of 2022, and then by September that year we had chosen 8 locations. This is sort of like half of Finland, so that there's still a part missing, which is sort of like the Lapland and the north, but this is more like in the sort of center and southern Finland and more on the west coast. But none of them are really like huge cities, except for maybe Turku. but even from who the participants were this activist group trying to save the local city block from overdevelopment. I'm not going to talk so much about the individual projects, but just to say that we tried to select a very sort of wide range of different projects, and not even all of them were like fully like projects that had sort of started, but there were also projects that kind of were more like dreams of projects. There were arts festivals trying to kind of like go into the land use and urban planning, sort of become like a stakeholder in their city. There were reuse of historical environments. There was a building designed by Alvarado in these very early days that is in the process of becoming a residency program, and like children's summer camps, etc. Then the sort of like small program part, these are the names of the places or the operators, the 8 chosen ones. We realized from very early on that because we couldn't really provide like one solution for everyone, and that's probably not even possible nowadays, because every location is like every local person is an expert of their local conditions, so you cannot like from the government try to give a guideline to like here's how you should plan your environment. So we realized that also within our group of 8 let's say participants or groups, they also had different groups within themselves. Like some of them were sort of more working with the existing planning framework, for instance, and some of them were working with strategies that were more tied to cultural heritage or built environment heritage, sort of built heritage. And then there were like purely sort of artistic or cultural practitioners sort of like coming into the sphere of architectural policy and kind of like that. So we said that, yeah, everything is like okay, like maybe this sector kind of can be the driver in your, or like your location, who is sort of the driver of the architectural policies. And what you always do is you start to then have the program. We met in many of these locations, kind of like trying to share whatever we knew already and all the questions that were not yet asked. And it became very obvious that when we kind of like went through many of these locations, that there was always someone local who knew a lot about like what the buildings are, what their history is, what the places are. And walking basically became one of the practices, and even to organize this kind of like walks can be seen as an architectural policy action. This kind of situations were almost like amazing empty spaces, trying to find new uses. It's a very common situation in Finland all around the country currently. Some of the meetings also took place in countryside and a little bit like far off locations with adults, and then also environments where children learn about environment and architecture. We also hosted some public events and seminars and trying to sort of like engage with the society that way as well. This is from Kuopio, where we had a event happening at the Contemporary Art Festival. We also did a podcast because we realized that often somehow like getting people to talk is easier than getting them to write. And then one reason to then compile it into into some sort of a book published format was that we also realized that since we couldn't really draft like a sort of a manual for everyone, and we could only sort of like do a kind of like a summary of the things that we have been doing and some of the conversations that have started, but we did realize that it is often very useful to have something in your hand when you go talk to someone about what you've already done. So we thought about the book as a kind of also an architectural policy tool that when we created together with these local municipalities and the local groups, then they get something. It's sort of like an exchange of sort of like that you gave us your time, we give you this tool that you can go and use when you apply for funding or you want to start a conversation with your local government or the regional government, and sort of say that we are already part of this, and this is the government project. So it's kind of validation for in many ways for these kind of that can be super grassroots level operations. So then we created this book. I had 2 co-editors, so it was not only me. So when I say we, I mean us as an editorial team, and then it just kind of contains our thinking and kind of the content. We tried to draft what happened, those strategies, the sort of regional development side of things, the repurposing and built heritage strategies, and this idea of the cultural agency as a possible architectural policy strategy. We also included some articles from researchers and experts in city planning. And it was interesting to, for instance, there's an article about how in many cities you have also like multiple local sort of identities. Like for instance in Helsinki, the city district of Vuosaari, which is kind of very far in the east, kind of has this own island identity that people that first move there have kind of like built their lives and their families' lives there, and they always feel like they're from there rather than from Helsinki, for instance. And how the city planners have to sort of learn to live with that. So that is the book. And this kind of, we feel like, well, it captures something in the moment, that this won't be the end of the activities that we do, but it will be some kind of like a starting point and something that we can refer to. But maybe just to continue a little bit on the idea that what is the meaning, I think, behind this idea of what the architectural policy locally can mean. And I think that it's, first of all, very difficult to talk about architecture with people, and it's hard to talk about politics with people. And then you have sort of architectural policy or the politics of architecture or space. It's already super confusing. It's not something that you can kind of go and sort of organize at some random city hall, like sort of like, hey everyone, let's talk about architectural policy. What does it even mean? It's not like that's one thing that we kind of like noticed. But at the same time, what I've discovered is that it often is a very good place to discuss local futures when you sort of get the people to start talking and then say that you're already, this is architectural policy that we're talking. So our findings are that every place has a local context, so local context is key. So only these local operating models can happen in those contexts. And that's sort of the practical part, but one important part is also that architecture is a place where people can dream and sort of like dream up utopias of like how they would want to live or how they would want to use their own environment, what they want to see in that, or what they want to. do than that. And these opportunities and possibilities sort of belong to everyone. And I think the architectural policy is a great place to sort of like invite people to talk about these dreams as well. Sort of say that you have every right to sort of like present your hopes and dreams, your design dreams in this context. So instead of these local policies, maybe it just should be talk about how to develop your local environment. Maybe that's an easier concept to talk about. Another big finding in a way was that, since I mentioned earlier those population graphs that were going down, it also means that there's less and less public resources. There are less and less architects and city planners working in some of those municipalities around the country, at least in Finland. So there won't be like a sort of a wise, all-knowing architect to kind of take care of all these dreams. So who are the new architects and the who dreamers of these places? So we were thinking that it should really be important to understand that whoever is interested, the people who are invested in those localities, their information, knowledge, and ideas and work and their agency kind of like can become a resource for changing the environment that where they live. So I think from those projects that are depicted here and the inklings of those projects, we sort of are starting to see that, you know, there might be like now forming some new participatory models so that let's say a small city can take a permanent sort of like a planning panel of local associations, part of their actual planning work, so that the ideas and the kind of what goes where don't just land from somewhere, like there's an investment and then it just happens that here will be a new supermarket or something, but it's more like that they have the say in what happens, and things aren't like kind of randomly taking place. And then there is also this idea that since policy programs are often very sort of top-down, that there is a sort of maybe like an international policy landscape, the EU or someone says about like how the spatial development, how cities are supposed to develop, and maybe in sustainability as this structure. And then in our thinking, we were more interested in like how they all somehow exist in the same universe, that the local can also be very international, or the international can be very local. This is not a new idea, but it's in the policy framework, it felt like an interesting topic. So in the title of the book, we also kind of wanted to introduce the idea of new locality, sort of like that in this world that is sort of becoming more the same everywhere, like kind of like globalization of commerce and retail, and like kind of like changes the landscape so that every city in the world has the same shopping malls. Locality is a kind of like a sort of like a re-examination of that as a sort of a cultural movement or something like this could be like a more interesting way to move forward, and it's sort of like try to a little bit also turn it into artistic practice. Fortunately, I think in the background, if we look at the international policies today, such as the European Davos or the Davos Declaration, it is a very locally driven kind of like a landscape of policies. So in that way, I think the idea of the new local is already quite sort of like in line with many of these policies. If you look at the kind of projects that, for instance, are awarded in the annual European Davos prizes and those projects, it's like many of these could be part of our group of projects or part of your activities. So it's not like anything that we're inventing anything new. It's more like that I think the tide is somehow going to this direction, even in the European architectural policies. We're also seeing this in the Nordic countries. For instance, the new Helsinki local architectural policy program launched this year is sort of like very focused on placemaking and kind of like taking some sort of like new models of citizen, sort of participatory placemaking strategies part of the actual city planning. So there are like, for instance, dedicated sites that will be designed by the citizens, or that ARKTIS, who is the one of the national agencies in Sweden responsible for architecture and design policies, they have these sort of, for instance, the powers of places or visions for the North initiatives. And even the Oslo Architecture Triennial, or like even, but like in addition, talks about neighborhoods and reforming communities. So this is everywhere around us. And a little callback to one of our collaborations with Anna, and also some of the material that you see here. It's also like in many other kinds of practices, you can see the same interest that we don't necessarily have the agency in the planning machinery to sort of like go to those sites and those places, but maybe there are already the people who can, and kind of like looking at these so-called strategies from low or new localities or situated practices is a way to sort of like find out what's there. The same way that I work in architectural policy, I also work with public art, and kind of like the expansion of that, I guess, is more largely the public sphere and kind of like public space. And for instance, for several years, we've already published another publication that looks at somehow the state of public art in Finland. And for instance, the last year we had this title, Welcome to the Periphery, which is meant to be that periphery in a way doesn't even exist. I'm ending this little TED talk into a few clips from, I'm not showing the clips, but that some of the impacts that our project has had is that, for instance, in the city of Pula, this is at the museum, at the regional museum there, we had a panel conversation, and in the local, we invited the local city government, for instance, to attend, and for some reason, because they felt like, okay, now someone from the government kind of invites us, so we have to come. And there were like quite sort of high-ranking city officials that wouldn't normally come to the museum panel talks about like built heritage or something. And the topic of that panel was this singular building, which is by Rikard kind of well-known-ish Finnish architects, or in this sort of regional, critical, postmodernism style, who weren't so appreciated when they completed these projects. For instance, this is a combination of elderly people housing, and then there's another sort of adjacent building, which is a kindergarten. This building was empty and sort of facing a very uncertain future, but because we organized somehow simultaneously many panel talks and orchestrated that the local press will be there and the national news broadcasting service. So now currently the city decided that, yeah, we're just going to use it in the future. as an elderly people's home than it actually is. Because in a way they couldn't lose their face in the national discussion. This is the housing area where it is. I just wanted to show it because I kind of like the Soviet vibes of it. Another project that is included in this booklet is a shortwave radio station, also in the same city, where we've been working. It's very close to this suburb, and we kind of like, as part of the European LINA satellite programs, organized this kind of like a live broadcast event that where we try to talk about buildings as a resource, and this idea of finding the right resource for the right need. And this has also become quite a successful story, because the city also decided that after many years of contemplating on what to do with this weird building that has a very fascinating history as well, that they will place it in their own sort of like investment program to develop this into a kind of a normal community facility for the housing area that they will kind of like build in the surroundings. And I think like in some small part, us to have this project included here, and the manager of that program and that project kind of like having this in their hand and going to the city real estate department saying that I don't think we should ignore this building, had something to do with it. Maybe it didn't, but it maybe helped. So I think these are the ways that we've been able to advance certain similar issues that let's say the building complex in Krvavica kind of has experienced as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mika, for showing us the state of architectural policy in Finland.
Oh, I should maybe add that the architectural policy programs are not like kind of like well managed in Finland. It's more like that this is something we have been able to do, but it is really also just working with the communities that kind of drives them, rather than the government money. Yeah.
I think we'll find many similarities with the projects that we'll be discussing later on that are very, very local, but unfortunately there is no architectural policy in Croatia, especially not related to localities and situated practices. So maybe it would be good for us to carry this publication around when we go to our city offices and things.
We can send you more.
Yeah, and send in more copies of the book. I don't know if maybe there are some immediate questions now for Mika or from the audience. Yes, something.
I'm just curious, how did you overcome, or how did you deal with these long bureaucracy processes within the government and the local municipalities to be able to do something in relatively short time?
Yeah, well, I think the answer in a way is like partly a bit sad because it's probably due to the fact that, because I work at the arts and culture sector, so it's often so overlooked that there kind of is no like kind of huge bureaucracy around these projects. So they kind of like, we can operate rather freely because we sort of like, we're not the main concern in the government. But it's kind of easy to foster conversations when you say that this is public space, public art, architecture, local people. And then it sort of just starts to roll, and then at a certain level or such a point, it's just that when you get the city government included, then they realize that, oh, it's actually like, now we have to do something. But it somehow happens in the shadow of this that the arts and culture is so overlooked.
And the media and broadcast,
Yeah,
of course, helps.
yeah,
the problem.
exactly, yeah. So that's maybe one answer.
Thanks.
More questions?
I'm wondering if the trend that you pointed out, this popularity of neighborhood initiatives and participative approaches, that it also has a kind of a problematic side to it, because I personally see it in the first place as a symptom of the dissolution of welfare state. So what we have is what we had like 50 years ago. State had money and was and willing to invest that money in public infrastructure. So they were building streets, hospitals, health centers, apartments. They didn't have time to ask, what would you like it to be, like that or that? They just invested money. Marasović, also architect who developed the Krvavica project, didn't do any, as far as I know, participatory, I don't know, but they built.
Yeah.
And they provided, at least in terms of quantity, and as we see also in terms of quality, a lot. What they do now is they don't want to invest money in public infrastructure. Instead, the money is transferred to cultural politics and institutions because they need 10 times less money, not 100 times less money than really investing in infrastructure itself would need. So I'm asking myself, are there ways how we could somehow avoid or bypass or these situations in which we are put, kind of, and we serve through our engagement?
Yeah, it's a very good point, because also I don't want to propagate the kind of like that because there's no money, then everyone now has to sort of manage themselves or something. But maybe in some cases, it just is the reality that if you still want to live in a certain locality, then maybe you are your best kind of like a city planner, or you are your best source of ideas. But maybe the one point that I didn't make so clear is that we also did kind of like try to really find experts locally. So it's not like some kind of like everyone's ideas. So because that doesn't still produce like the best outcome, that everyone is asked, what do you want, what do you want, what do you want? That's not the point, but it's more like that there is resources that are in the local context that have not been participating in the, and then when the city municipal sort of the people who sort of like call the shots, they often don't have access to those discussions because they might sort of like kind of just make the decisions and like, I guess we have to do this, I guess we have to,
Basically, we are talking about a gap which is present in local needs or needs of locals, and transferring that knowledge about that needs to the point where you can develop something, do something with that. So there is a gap, which this book is like a bridge. It's, you use it, you talk about that in that sense. So that's, I think that's present on a global scale. That we have no tools developed in a way that we can transfer that talks about our needs, because we are not articulated well talking about what we need really. We can talk about what is bothering us, but it's first what we see. We recognize the pain or something like that, and we are mostly talking about that. But the need is something different. So architectural policies are a way or language or tool to find what the need really is, because if the government has a lot of money, they can do whatever. But maybe they will waste their money. Maybe that's not what we really need.
Yeah.
And it's easy because you can show and say, okay, we did it. But the problem is that we often don't talk in the right way to find the right solutions. That's the problem.
And also, I think I mean, maybe more so related to the Nordic countries is that, or at least Finland, there used to be this kind of a very clear framework of the welfare state, like kind of like why this school needs to exist and why this healthcare needs is there, and kind of like a planning system. But it's kind of crumbled, and there is no other system. There is nothing to replace it. There's all more like much of confusion at what is the world today, and is anything that we build really sustainable, and like so many different conversations. So that's why I think that nothing is really taking its place except that kind of like overall policy. Then perhaps the acceptance that there cannot maybe be this kind of like a vast countrywide policy anymore, but it's sort of like, well, just we have to do the best we can policy in a way. Obviously, then there can be good principles and there can be good architecture.
Yes, it really comes down to this motto, we need it, we do it. It's something that we have been doing for decades in very different formations and projects, struggles for the public space, for certain buildings, or let's say the peculiarity of the project in Krvavica, and what Anna was asking about the state, the fall of the welfare state, even in our countries. It's actually every action being in this sort of stress of cooptation, whether political cooptation, state cooptation, what is actually happening either to, let's say, a former children's resort, will it be gentrified? It will definitely not become yet another children's resort. In a best case scenario, it will become an elderly home for the Nordic people residing by the Atlantic Sea. So it's always this danger, like, what are we doing and what are good intentions, paying the good intentions in 10 years or even less. It will be something completely different beyond our political horizons. So yeah, we're going to be talking about this topic later on also in our localized projects. So maybe if you will agree, have just really a short break of 5 minutes and then we can continue. Yeah, okay, thank you.